and soy and
You have
animal
all the
feed into it.
countries from Morocco all the way to Afghanistan that are very dry. They don't have a lot of good land for growing. Their populations have grown massively over the last 30, 40 years, and they can't feed themselves. And yes, the Russians sank 7, 8 huge grain ships of the Ukrainians, and they've cut off all that grain. Ukrainians feed those countries, and now it's not happening. Well, you can't. I mean, look, if everybody can't make it, then you don't want to warn people, because then you're going to have food shortages now. You're going to have the collapse coming early, and you're going to have less time to prepare if you are the government, if you are the elite, whatever, if that's what's happening. You go to the other stuff about them planning a nuclear war, using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine, China going to war. Well, if you have a nuclear war beginning, you would be just like a meteor strike hit the West, right? If you went all out to use these weapons. And so my question is, were these FSB analysts being asked the question, would the Russian economy survive a nuclear war in which we hit them and they can't hit us back?
And good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Jeffrey Nyquist. We've had a couple interviews before, and today we really wanted to talk about what's going on in China. Why are they cutting the wheat early? And then also some geopolitics on the food end of things coming out. We're getting some solid numbers around the world right now of what the first projected losses would be, and those will tick up. So Jeffrey, thanks for joining me. And as we were on the call earlier, we were talking about war preparations and what's happening with North Korea and China right now.
Yeah, the lockdowns, not only in Shanghai, but, a couple of weeks ago, it was more than 280 million people in other cities, and they're closing down ports, not just Shanghai. They're closing down all those parts of their economy and all those cities that produce things for the United States supply chain, all the stuff you see in Walmart. They're shutting down those people, hundreds of millions of people. You probably just saw the news yesterday. They're further slicing the food that's being sent to these people who are welded into their apartments, locked in. Please don't let them out on the street. They're not allowed to go to the store. Goodness knows if they're getting adequate food deliveries. You hear people howling from their balconies of these giant apartment buildings in China. And they're claiming they're doing it because they're doing it because they have a zero tolerance for COVID. It's bizarre.
Zero tolerance for the United States and our dollar. So I was looking at the ports that are closed now. Tianjin is also hitting that list where they're starting to really trickle supplies. And I'll give you a secondhand story here. A friend of mine who does deliveries and works within the Walmart, I guess, web. He doesn't actually work for Walmart, but he is a supplier to them and goes into the stores and then, does some inventory in there. Mm-hmm. He knows the main buyer for all of Walmart across the different regions. And this was specifically Southeast region, that they're closing the Walmart offices and the stores close to where this woman was working. And she said, it's good we go anyway, because in 6 months, there's going to be nothing at all coming into our stores here. Now, that verifies what you just said. And I just had that as kind of a dot over here of, how could that be that they would run out of goods? But we see the bottleneck of what, 23,000 or 21,500 ships. It's hard to keep up anymore. Mm-hmm. Waiting off of Shanghai and the entire coast of China. When you look at it, at least 25% of all ships in the world are stuck off of China right now.
Yeah, of course, they're not going anywhere.
No, they're not loading, they're not unloading. And then China needs an enormous amount of food, which I wanted to cover as well. But what do you think about happening in North Korea? They just on the bullhorn one afternoon, everybody go home, everybody get inside, don't ask questions, everybody go home, and everything just.
This is either a drill and pre-war, or they're very close to war with us. I'm very worried about next month, because Look, I've been hearing for 2 years. 2 years this month is the first time I heard it in the first weeks of COVID outbreak, that China was getting ready for war against the United States and Russia was with them. I had sources from Southeast Asia that were saying that the governments in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam were told to maintain cadre from the top leadership of the countries in permanent nuclear war bunkers in case the Americans caught wind of what was going on, and that Russia and China were going to be doing a series of moves leading to thunderous war. This is what my sources, and it wasn't just that source. I had a Russian source with connections high up in the Russian scientific establishment that they were getting ready for war. In fact, the source became so frightened he left the United States at that time because he thought the United States was going to be nuked, because the word was the Chinese were pushing the Russians to start the war in 2020, in the autumn of 2020. And the Russians were dragging their feet saying, we're not ready, we can't go now. There's another angle to this that's very bizarre. This invasion of Ukraine, which caught everybody by surprise. Peter Zian, the former Stratfor analyst, has a very interesting little data point that I've talked to other analysts, and they say, look, he's the only guy that has this information. We can't validate it, but this is what he was saying, that the US broke into the internal email communications of the Russian general staff and some of the top people in the Kremlin last autumn. And that's how they knew Russia was preparing this invasion. But here, the big surprise of almost all the analysts is that the United States and Britain and these other countries, even Germany, have rushed in to put sanctions on Russia and to help Ukraine, because there wasn't all that much love for Ukraine. We didn't do anything when Donbass got invaded, when the sanctions that were put on at that time were actually a relief to Russia, because we were only sanctioning certain oligarchs and Russian officials who don't have any money in the West anyway, for the most part. And we actually took off the Jackson-Vanik sanctions, which really was to Russia's benefit, which was odd. That's what Obama did in December of 2016. But what's really, really odd, what Zion says is very bizarre, is that when we read the Russian military emails, top generals, this is restricted to about 12 people at the top of the Russian military. They were going to go through Ukraine. They thought they were going to go through in a week. When their forces got up to NATO's border, they were going to invade NATO using tactical nuclear weapons. And of course, tactical nuclear weapons, they're fired out of artillery. They're use short-range ballistic missiles. So they got to get up close. They got to get their whole military up to that NATO border. And that this is the only explanation I've heard as to why NATO, our usual leaders, aren't really that big on interfering with when the Russians are threatening nuclear war. Why would they not cave into that threat? Well, it's because nuclear war, they saw, would be coming anyway. What's really interesting about it is the way this meshes with what China and North Korea are doing. And there was this announcement in China days before the invasion of Ukraine, and the Russian Navy, both of them announced massive naval exercises where they were going to put all their ships to sea. And they both announced them around the same time, around the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. There was increased naval activity in Chinese ports. And then when the invasion failed, when Kiev, that first weekend, Kiev did not fall, the activity in the Chinese ports ceased. You didn't hear anything more about both navies going to sea. They haven't gone to sea. This was in February. This was around the 22nd of February. So it's like, wait a minute. Now, in a nuclear war, you send all your ships to sea, your warships, because they're vulnerable in the ports. And I had a conversation with a Chinese source 3 weeks ago, and she told me, and she has people throughout China, that Russian submarines were using Chinese naval bases. And they were using these Chinese merchant ships to play a shell game by going underneath them and escaping detection from our satellites and anti-submarine warfare detection system. So they're deploying, the Russians were moving submarines into Chinese ports and then out again. Very, very strange. And that shows real coordination. So, and we know that North Korea is part of the system. The Russians 5 years ago, Russia doubled the track lines, the railroad track lines going from Russia into North Korea. There's this narrow border that they have there just south of Vladivostok. And they increased their number of military advisors in North Korea. The DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So it looks like a very large war preparation. And we had the victory parade on Monday in Moscow. A lot of analysts, again, expected Putin to either announce a general mobilization or to announce victory and seek some kind of, just leave the line where it is. He did neither. The war continues. No announce of a general mobilization. Everybody's kind of baffled. What is he doing? Why is this going on?
Well, I could add on to that. If you just saw the last couple of days, Chinese navies everywhere surrounding Taiwan, and they even had their Liaoning carrier to the east with their battle group out off the east coast of Taiwan, not in the strait, which would be a way to cut off resupply coming in from the Pacific Ocean. So what you just said about all the ships coming out, but I'm starting to look at that and say, wait, you got 16,000 ships a week ago, and now it's up to 20,000+ ships. And we're not talking about small fishing boats. We're talking about giant container ships, breakbark, oil tankers, and everything in between. How's that Navy going to be running through all that traffic that's out there? Because some of these maps I'm looking at, it's surrounding South Korea. The amount of traffic hanging off there is going out beyond South Korea into the sea. And the entire strait is choked off with just waiting traffic. So I'm wondering how you really in earnest get a carrier group out through that without hitting another ship. And then with all those other smaller cruisers, landing craft, et cetera, coming from Fujian province that are out in the waters as well. So, yeah, that story sounds good, but I'm looking at the real logistics on the biggest traffic jam ever in naval history ever. Multiplied by 100 or more. And then carrier groups are supposed to be just sailing through, smooth sailing, just blazing through there. It seems like we're getting a couple different storyline. But what does match is what you said when they were going to go with Russia. All the ships came out. Well, that's happening right now. Their carrier groups are out. Everything's out of the ports. And again, they're locking down Tianjin. So that's a big port up near Beijing. As far as I know, Qingdao port is still open, but everything south of Tianjin, all the way down through all the estuaries and deltas, even way down to Hong Kong and that whole Pearl River Delta area and Guangzhou, that area has been offline since the pretty much beginnings of COVID. It never really recovered. That's where we sit today. So it does look like there's a complete breakdown in everything shipping wise coming over to the US. I'm sure they'll find a route through for food, though.
Well, you probably heard the reports that China has stockpiled 67% of the world's stockpiled grain and food reserves. That China evidently has been the last few years buying up food everywhere, all over the markets, evidently preparing for this so that they can get by without needing to. Now, they don't know how long they'll need to get by, but this is a really strategic thing, because if China doesn't stockpile food before a war, 2 Indian destroyers in the Indian Ocean can cut their fuel, collapse their industrial economy, collapse their agriculture, and that would kill 500 million Chinese within, 9 months, a year? So if they've stockpiled such enormous amounts of grain, it is an indication of war. It is an indication of a planned war. And let me explain something very basic to your listeners. A lot of analysts have said there can't be a war between the United States and China because of the trade. There's too much money going back and forth. We depend on them and they depend on us, so there can't be a war. Similar argument was made 110 years ago, that there couldn't be a war between Britain and Germany because they had such an intensive trading relationship. But again, in 1914, when World War I started and the Germans invaded Belgium, the British declared war on them. So these two countries that were so dependent on each other economically, that had such a relationship, they did go to war. So it's happened before, but here, even before an actual war, the Chinese are turning off the trade.
Dare I say, everybody seems to be working in conjunction, because you can't tell me 50 central banks all raise their rates in a single week across the planet, all in tandem. And as I've been saying, it's like a school of fish now. The governments are like a school of fish. Whatever happens planetarily, I think more governments know that the onset of this cycle is going to be much more heavy and powerful than the first anticipated 400-year cycle intensity. And suddenly there seems to be a lot more information that we're going, at least at the minimum, 2,000-year cycle intensity, which would have a lot more effects on our interplanetary magnetic field, our magnetic field here on the planet, and where our cloud cells and jet streams stay locked in or not, because of the weakening magnetosphere or electromagnetic field around our planet.
Yeah.
When that weakens, things move. So it must be something far above orders of magnitude of what was originally predicted. It does seem like it's all choreographed for me. It doesn't look random at all. Everything seems planned, especially the way since the beginning of COVID, all countries are now moving like a school of fish. One says, they all follow. And the thing that gave it away is looking at that chart the other day, 50 plus central banks all in the same week raised their rates. So they're turning off the spigot and the levers and the gears of the economy at the same time as the trade's being cut off from China.
Well, that would actually economically make sense, because if you are going to have less, you have a threat of currency collapse and runaway inflation. If you don't raise interest rates in the face of goods being cut off on large measure, you're going to have an economic problem. So I'm sure the reaction is sort of normal for what economists think. But I wanted to ask you, did you see, probably, I know you follow this, I saw that the coldest temperatures ever recorded on Earth were recorded in Antarctica here last month, yeah, in April, right? Did you see that? It was over 200 degrees negative Fahrenheit. Am I remembering that right?
No, because that would be approaching absolute zero. But it happened for multiple days in a row. That's the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, it
wasn't
and
like
by
2
the
minutes
way,
in and out. It was days, plural. And then look across the hemispheres, how many snowstorms and record blizzards catching people off guard here right now. I got 15 inches of snowfall in the Sierras, and there's just an enormous amount of unusual snowfalls. Oh, and here's another outlier. Finland, just last week, every temperature station across the country was reading below freezing.
Last week,
100% of them in Finland.
Wow, in Finland.
Yeah, and that was what, first week of May.
This is here's the thing. In trying to figure out what this whole thing means, I think it's important to say that these lower temperatures in Antarctica weren't just a few degrees higher than the lowest high. It was like almost 30 degrees colder than it had ever been recorded.
Yeah, but at the same time of the year, that's the unusual thing is
April.
It's going into the depths of winter.
It's going into winter. It's headed for winter. Yeah.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be in the fall temperatures at that point.
Right. Yeah. It's
I mean, in the depths of winter there, yeah, I could agree. It gets really cold in Antarctica.
Yeah. And it isn't really the depth of winter yet, so what
close.
is it?
We need to get in July for that.
And that was Vostok, Antarctica, I believe, is where they measured those temperatures. But getting back to the war thing, this will intrigue you. Have you heard of the FSB letters?
Not by FSB. Yeah, explain a little more.
Okay, there were an FSB analyst who was very upset, leaked letters of his own frustration with the FSB being blamed for the Russian military failures in Ukraine.
Okay, stop there. FSB, can you give us the acronym, what the words are for
that? Yeah, it's the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. That's a former KGB. Okay. So it's a former KGB. So it's the organization that Putin was in charge of before he became prime minister in 1999. So the FSB, they are more than merely the domestic service like the KGB was. They also do analysis and other things. So it's They have the SVR, which is the Foreign Service, and they're both under what's called the MGB now, the Ministry of State Security, which it was called before it was called the KGB. So it's the MGB again. But anyway, this analyst, these FSB letters, which have been translated by I believe it's an American race car driver of Russian origin who has good enough Russian to translate them. What they say is this FSB analyst explains that this war in Ukraine was decided by a very small number of people and that the analysts themselves weren't even told. But here's the weird thing, and I think that even the analyst here is misunderstanding. The FSB analysts were told months and months, many moons ago, that to give analysis of what would happen to the Russian economy if there was this giant meteor strike on the Earth that wiped out the whole West. What would be the effect on the Russian economy? Would the Russian economy be able to get through it without the things that it imports from the West? Now, this is months before the Ukraine war started.
That's an interesting way to phrase it. Yeah.
It is a very interesting, and he said they did not trust us to tell us. And so we were expected with this crazy scenario of the West gets hit by this. Now, see, what's really interesting is that he's interpreting that it meant that they were referring to the sanctions that Russia would experience.
Yeah, right.
Because
that's exactly
Russia
what it
was still, until a few days ago, Russia was still getting $1 billion a day from that gas pipeline that runs through Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians have lowered the amount coming through there now a little bit, I think by a third, by 27%, 28%. But still, Russia's still getting, but this was like a total cutoff now. You go to the other stuff about them planning a nuclear war, using tactical nuclear weapons on Ukraine, China going to war. Well, if you have a nuclear war beginning, you would be just like a meteor strike hit the West, right? If you went all out to use these weapons. And so my question is, were these FSB analysts being asked the question, would the Russian economy survive a nuclear war in which we hit them and they can't hit us back? Right? That's
Airburst, EMP. It might be even in a satellite already orbiting. We would never know.
We would never know. Yeah. Yeah. And what a lot of people don't know about nuclear war, and this was my big shock, 32 years ago when I got into studying it. I had read the Russian literature on nuclear war, and they were like, oh yeah, nuclear war is winnable entirely. We just have to you just have to destroy certain targets and you can win. And I thought, that's crazy. Nuclear war would end the world. So I went and I studied the environmental study. There is no nuclear winter. It's not true. The final study on it said that you'd have to build a nuclear weapon the size of the Empire State Building that would cost you more than the gross domestic product of all the countries of the world put together. You'd have to mine uranium on the moon because there's not enough of it on the Earth to make the bomb. And then you could create nuclear winter. But these little firecrackers we got, it isn't not enough. These Krakatoa-like explosions and these meteorites that hit the Earth that could cause it, they've got the equivalent of 300 million megaton bombs. So they just have it's just not enough. Our little puny human ability to influence the climate. So, but what was really interesting to me was that when I studied the effects of fallout, it was that hydrogen bombs are clean. You airburst them, there is no fallout. Only if you ground burst them are you going to get, short-term fallout, goes away in 13 to 18 days. And then the other thing is, the fallout from a hydrogen bomb, it's so small that if you just quit smoking, you've more than compensated for the risk, the cancer risk from it. It's a very, very small increase in cancers. So, and by the way, we already experienced that with the above ground fission bomb test, those dirty fission bombs we tested in the 40s and the 50s. We had a huge increase in cancers in the 1960s, in the mid 1960s and early 70s from that, because that stuff was still coming down through the atmosphere. But anyway, so nuclear war is, and they think this way. And so my fear is what we're seeing, if you line up everything we're seeing, it looks like somebody's desperate enough to start a nuclear war. Do you think the Russians and Chinese? Now, one Chinese source said they were planning to do this in 2035. That was their long-range plan, to attack the West. And for some reason, they moved it up. Is that because of this grand solar minimum? Is that because of the Earth's electromagnetic field? What do you think?
Well, it's not just our planet. Everywhere you look across the solar system, there's anomalies. I mean, back 2020, Pluto's atmosphere collapsed. And 6 months later, Neptune, its atmosphere reversed. The dark storm broke apart and reversed itself. And then Mars had the minerals started glowing with auroras just 6 months ago. So that's what I mean by they realize now it's a more intense cycle coming in.
Is this starting in the outer planets and working its way in?
It is, yeah. That was the whole thing is, they were seeing X-rays jumping off Uranus off to the rings. And now, I don't know if you saw that just maybe 2 weeks ago, the news releases with the thermal imaging dropping in temperature so unexpectedly that they called it an ice age happening on that planet because it dropped so fast that it blew everybody's mind on how quickly the temperatures dropped. Yeah. And then, before the solar, we're coming into solar maximum several years from now, but the trough was a year longer, a year and 7 months, and they'd predicted it to be. So magnetic field from the sun was really weak. And then in turn, more, energetic particles were running down the north and south poles of Jupiter and igniting their aurora 10 to 20 times higher, more intense, where you could actually see a blue halo with your naked eye from the Earth. That's what's happening now.
From the naked eye.
Yeah, because I knew once I knew that was happening. I have binoculars and a telescope, and I live way out here in East Tennessee. It is so star crispy out here. It's like being in your own planetarium. Really, it's that bright and that clean out here, especially after a front moves through and it's just literally twinkling stars. And then you put the binoculars on it and wow. And then you get the telescope on it and you're like, whoa. With something larger and intelligent design out here than we're just a very small part of, but the whole as well. We are consciousness having a human experience. And then looking at how the star field, how wide it is, it really just, there's something else greater than, us putting all of this into motion and keeping it in motion. And once you look out at that was the whole thing, is knowing that Jupiter was coming with super heavy aurora. So I took time out to go look for it. It wasn't like I just looked up. It was, I knew it was happening. So I consciously was looking for it. And sure enough, it looked blue from the sky here on the ground. So now, what are you going to do? Is it China? Now you need to talk about China for a second, Chinese history. Now, if you go back, say 3,000 years, you cannot find a Chinese dynasty that's lasted longer than 400 years because these grand solar minimums wipe out food production, food growing, areas shrink, plant and harvest dates shrink. And that's a fact that a lot of people didn't know. And just even knowing that one fact about Chinese history will totally reset the way you think. Because if these grand solar minimum cycles are on a 400-year period and Chinese dynasty collapses around 380 or 350 to 400, there's something really that syncs up there. But if we're coming out to a heavy, more powerful cycle on a 2,000 years power, that's going to really start shifting a lot of things, including what we're seeing in the other planets. Then what?
Are we talking about the event that maybe is alluded to in the book Hamlet's Mill?
I don't know if it would be that. It would be in part, but they're talking about the cataclysmic disasters, on orders of magnitude that wipe it back down to, 10 million humans on the planet.
Right.
That kind of disaster coming in versus electromagnetic field changes. So you got two choices here. You can come clean with the populace and say, hey, by the way, we knew this 30 years ago. We threw global warming in your face so you wouldn't look too deeply. And by the way, it's time to start growing your food. Sorry, my bad. But can you pay your taxes next year? We need a little more money to prepare for our continuity of government. Or you just wouldn't tell people and it would cause too much panic.
I had a reader that had connections that contacted me about 5-6 weeks ago, said that the FEMA was massively stockpiling food for the government. Have you heard this?
Yeah, and that explains a lot of the disappearance of the rail cars and also the shipping containers. Because, I've spoken about this maybe last year. There was a lot of shipping containers that disappeared off the face of the earth to the point where I think it was Hapgood Lloyd put an order in for 1.5 million brand new shipping containers.
Mm.
So where did the other ones go? Oh, they're just stuck up a Himalayan mountain high over in China or something was the excuse, but that wasn't, because then in China, they're like, we don't have enough shipping containers because they're all outbound. We're waiting for them to come back in. Ships in between transit points.
Right. So we were holding on to them.
Well, you're packing them full and then putting them underground, continuity of government. I mean, they're being used.
Right.
They didn't just
right.
disappear. They're still on the earth. They just are being used. And rail cars too, this whole thing about, you know, the BNSF are saying, oh, we can't take on any more route. Oh, our freight cars are full. We can't do this. Or they're cutting routes. They're cutting deliveries. Where are the rail cars going? Same exact place. Because imagine how much you can put on a rail car versus what you can put in, say, even a 53-foot container.
Do you think that this electromagnetic event is going to happen this summer?
No, my dates on it are October of 2024.
October of 2024. Have any astronomers publicly commented on this, to your knowledge?
A few, but they had to retract. And
oh, really? Oh boy.
The intensity of it on the onset of the cycle begins now. Almost everybody that was looking at it from a energetic cycle onset was pinging right around these years here, around 2020-ish, plus or minus a couple years. So it seems like we're in it, and it seems that governments are responding to it. And one thing I don't understand with all this food that is not being grown at the moment, so let me give you a quick rundown on what's been publicly stated over the last week, or even 4 days. Rice production globally is going to decrease 10%. That's the initial starting number that they're giving you. But the lack of fertilizers is going to take that up to the next update you'll get is like, oh, it's going to be a lack of 15%. And eventually I think we'll get around 22% loss of global rice production this year. Now, you know how that's going to affect Asia. And they're coming out publicly already saying wheat is going to be down 20% based on just Ukraine and Russia alone. They didn't add any fertilizer losses because of the fertilizer shortages. They're not accounting for any of that. Herbicide shortages, chemical shortages, they're not accounting for any losses of yield in the field at all from those two factors, or actually three: pesticide, herbicide, and fertilizer. And diesel fuel prices going to record highs, and in availability, they're predicting a shortage here in the East Coast coming up in the next few days.
Could Russia's invasion of Ukraine be about taking the land because it's further south and it's better land for growing?
Oh, yeah. Like, look at the bread baskets that are under duress right now. You can't tell me Kazakhstan and Ukraine both go down in the same year, and those are the two biggest bread baskets in Eurasia. That's too coincidental. Again, with all these things happening, the contraction of the economy, the World Economic Forum saying they're going to reset right now. Why now? Why not 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when pollution was getting real bad? Everybody was opening Airbnbs. Flights were like 10 cents to go to the next country, millions of planes in the skies, and they decided, oh, this year we need to stop it. They just ran it to its last course here. So it's really, economy is not salvageable. So it'll be a controlled demolition. And the food is the big thing. Like China right now is sending to silage 6 weeks early their wheat crop.
Well, now, why would they do that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've had a fair few videos to watch, a lot of translation in it. And it goes like this. They're using a different counting system. It's called a mu, M-U. And there's 6.2 mu in an acre. So we're going to use the unit of mu because that's what they use there for the actual land area versus the dollar amount out for wheat crop. And it's renminbi. So igamu, and you'll get about 1,000 to 1,200 renminbi. So 1,000 renminbi for that mu to come out for the wheat. Well, somebody is on the open market saying we'll give you 1,500 renminbi if you cut it now to give it to us for animal food. Silage. And I think in Chinese it's sai le.
They're trying to keep their animals alive.
I'm not sure what's happening, but there's thousands of trucks lined up. So coming at from a farmer's perspective, they're going to make an extra 300 renminbi for that same acreage, and they're going to cut it 6 weeks early. They're not going to compete with everybody when they go to sell. Then the price drops like everywhere because there's a glut of it. Everybody's trying to sell in, and they go, no, there's more coming. There's 10 tons there. Why do we need to give you a premium price? Everybody's got wheat. We'll give you 6 cents, take it or leave it. And that's kind of what happens at harvest season. But somebody's coming in giving 1,500 renminbi per moo, and the farmers are jumping all over it. I mean, if I was a farmer, I would too. It's the most money they've ever made for their land, ever, hands down. You are got to be kidding me. Even with state set pricing, they still are making far more money. So video after video of combines going through and cutting silage, and then a whole wave of other farmers on megaphones, don't cut our food, don't cut our food. But what I don't understand is if it was really that organic, is it planned? Because you think the Chinese military would be up there stopping this right away, going, wait, you're cutting our food source down for silage before we get to harvest it, and we're already we're going into a war or some sort of food shortage. That's why they bought so many resources around the planet. And they're going to cut down part of their wheat crop to sell it for animal food. I don't know. Something really doesn't make sense there.
Well, if China goes into a war, you're going to have a period of months where they're not going to be able to import the oil and gas, the fuel, right? Because China's limited. I mean, the Russians can send them things, but their pipeline going out to China doesn't have the capacity, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad doesn't have the capacity. China would have to just sort of muddle through without sufficient energy supplies. And that would mean, all their tractors, the combines, everything in their economy shut. So for them to go to war.
That's totally why. Because, in the Tarim Basin, they've been, pulling a lot of oil out. And also at the same time when I was following peak oil, this is back like 2005, 6-ish. I started to learn a lot about the basins that were in China. And what they were doing at that time was refilling the wells that were able to refill in their limestone caverns and whatnot. They were even using limestone caverns to refill oil reserves inside there as their strategic oil reserve, refilling some of the depleted wells. And they call it the teapots. And that's these small refineries or crackers where they'll start to crack the fuels. But they're little small refinery, nothing like on the Exxon Mobil. I mean, like hometown kind small. And that was the thing. There was, all these there was an article at that time called Revolt of the Teapots, where all the small refineries were like, no, we don't want to do it at this price because there's set prices. Look at global prices, double what you're giving us. So we're just not even going to refine. And then, they had to raise the prices inside China, which made everybody incredibly angry because, people who drove back then, cars were kind of a new thing, 2003, 4 coming in China. It's not like, we just had cars. It was a big thing to get a car in 2004 in China. And to have fuel prices raised and not available because, the teapots weren't cranking it out. That totally makes sense. If they're going to not have enough fuel and they would rather get animal food out of that versus getting nothing and everything rotting in the fields.
Because they have to do
they have to do it right now.
They have to keep their animals alive. Yeah. Well, then here's another thought about this. If you are going to war and you know that food production is going to be interrupted, and food production is interrupted at the beginning of a war for China because you got India, and the Chinese Navy doesn't have the reach to battle the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. They have to first conquer certain areas, down there. They got to take Malaysia. They got to take Singapore. Then they can have basing to go on into the Indian Ocean. So it takes them a while to be able to clear the path to the Middle East.
I'll stop you right there. Navy, yes, but using Jiapu port over in Myanmar, and they already built massive rail lines and massive oil pipelines coming up through Myanmar. Because when I was working there, and this is why I started the Adapt 2030 channel, I was buying coffee, and we'd be running up in remote locations way past Pin Oluin.
Chinese operate
that far to go over to China from the back door there.
Can the Chinese, are they operating warships out of there now?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer for that, but I do know it's only a couple hundred miles once you unload off of Jiapu to get into Yunnan province and then on to Kunming.
I mean, Rangoon is
several oil unloading terminals there, and some of the biggest pipelines in Asia going from Jiapu into China.
Well, Rangoon is a fabulous port, is it not? It's a really good.
We're talking about not Yangon port. You need to go out back into Malacca Straits, way up to near the border with Bangladesh, and you'll find a place called Jiapu. It starts with a K. So remember, in Myanmar, it's a KY, it's a Jak.
Okay.
So KY, look for that port that starts with KY, way in the north up near Bangladesh. That's huge. They were doing massive dredging operations up there. I mean, massive.
Were the Chinese doing this?
Tankers of oil to unload there. That's how deep of a water a port it is.
And they actually have rail lines that now run through Myanmar to China.
Oh, sets, not a rail line. We're talking, 8-lane highway of rails going through there.
This was the old, during World War II, this was
Yeah, it was
known
the
as the
old,
Burma
yeah.
Road, right?
And
This
it was the
was
old Southern Silk Route too. So what's real interesting is, you look back in history and you see it's the Southern Silk Route that was used along with what you're talking about there for like the Flying Tigers when they were first getting in there, going up through Burma to set up, and also Yunnan province. It's really interesting flying the hump. And we get all these things in history that keep matching up for the same pass is used again and again and again. Khyber Pass. I mean, how long has the Khyber Pass been used through history? Thousands of years, and it's still very relevant today, even in our warfare or trade.
So if the Chinese could move their navy to those ports and operate out of those ports, they could then defeat the Indian Navy.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Now, how could you disassemble a ship and then bring it by rail and reassemble it across the land bridge
Submarines,
there?
you could do that with smaller submarines. I know that the Russians have done that with submarines. Well, what they'd want for warships is to be able to move the ordnance, the fuel for the warships, and the missiles and the ammunition for the ships, and torpedoes and stuff. Because warships only carry so many torpedoes and stuff. They go out, they have a fight, they got to come back, and they got to replenish those. And they don't have unlimited fuel. Much of the Chinese Navy are smaller warships, smaller surface ships, except for their submarines, and they can only go so far before they have to come back and refuel. So, and the Indian Ocean's pretty big, and if they have to cover all the way to the Arabian Sea to cover their transport, so the implication is that India would be nuked too. India would be hit,
Maldives.
or intimidated into neutrality, maybe.
Well, I know for sure China was setting up bases out in the Maldives, because they were giving them billions and billions and billions of dollars in aid. This is the Maldives, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were trying to get, and the story went, they were trying to get fishing rights, which they did. They got the exclusive fishing zone out there. So then Chinese trawlers went around and just scraped everything dry. And the local guys were like, whoa, just all the fish disappeared.
Now, there's an old British naval base that the
That's
Royal
right. They
Navy
got that.
used in Sri Lanka. It was where the British based their fleet out of. It used to be known by another name, but Sri Lanka was the basing
Ceylon.
area. What's that?
Or Ceylon or Ceylon.
Ceylon, yeah, Ceylon. That was where the British Navy, I think it was it the aircraft carrier Hermes operated out of there, and the Japanese sunk it in the Indian Ocean. There was I may be getting the name of the carrier wrong. The British were putting together a carrier group, and the same fleet that bombed Pearl Harbor Japanese sailed out into the Indian Ocean. That was their only incursion into it, and they sunk that British fleet. I've seen footage of they found where the ships are under the water. But is that would the Chinese have? I know the Chinese have been active in Sri Lanka. They could use that.
Well, they've been active all through the whole coastal regions heading over to the port of Yemen, because that's that string of pearls that they have along through the Indian Ocean. Gwadar is another one in Pakistan that they have access and control over. And, you said going way out in the Indian Ocean, but if you could base yourself in the Maldives and that port is operational, then that would be a stopover point. And then if you do follow the string of pearls, it does go from Jakpu over to Sri Lanka, over to Gwadar in Pakistan, and then it ends up over in the Gulf of Aden there. Now, the Chinese don't control that port going into the Red Sea, but what they do control are ports further down in Kenya and Tanzania. So that's where that string of pearls is kind of originating from, which brought me to my research of, with this West African monsoon shifting, using the Sahel to grow more food, also tapping the Nubian sandstone aquifer from underground water resources combined with increasing rainfall from above. And then you're going to have a massive grow zone there, but then you'll need to export the food back to China, which makes sense on the string of pearls, because then you could guard it the entire way along by Navy.
Right. And you would have to either have the Indian Navy and Air Force neutralized, or you'd have to have them joining. What about the food situation? I mean, India has this tremendous population, 1.1 billion, maybe it's 1.2 billion now. How do they fare in all this?
Well, you saw that they've ceased exports of wheat now.
Yes.
They're
Yes.
locking it up too. This whole resource nationalism or food nationalism is going to be, I think, the thing that drives famine way faster than the actual crop losses. It's the full disruption of anything exportable. So then I like to do the chasing the chain here, because you can already get a full list of the countries that are going to start to implode first. So just the lowest hanging fruit. What are the African nations that rely on the Ukraine and Russia for the majority of their wheat, corn, and soy and
You have
animal
all the
feed
countries
imports?
from Morocco all the way to Afghanistan that are very dry. They don't have a lot of good land for growing. Their populations have grown massively over the last 30, 40 years, and they can't feed themselves. And yes, the Russians sank 7, 8 huge grain ships of the Ukrainians, and they've cut off all that grain. Ukrainians feed those countries, and now it's not happening.
Well, I saw some incredibly interesting images of Russian army loading Ukrainian farm combines and different farm machinery on the rails and on trucks and taking it out.
Taking it out.
Which brings me back to the Holodomor, that whole 1930s Bolshevik Revolution starvation thing. So that's what they did. They took away the farm machinery and allowed them to starve, and then they cordoned off the area. I mean, anybody can read about this. 1930s Bolsheviks were super angry at the Ukrainians because they were growing wheat. There was a mechanization input and impetus, where then they started to grow 6 times more grain than prior, just a few years, because they were using machinery. Well, you grow more grain, you can sell more grain. And they were becoming incredibly wealthy, even bourgeois, with their little mansions, and they
the
wouldn't.
kulaks.
Yeah. Yeah, right.
Well, it was
chapter of history is repeating, where they're taking the farm machinery back out again, which I find startling. Like, thanks for the machinery. We'll take it back and grow grain in Russia.
Yeah, the thing about a regime like in China and Russia, the one thing they fear is a class of people who are independent, who have their own sources of money that aren't dependent on the government, that they could form their own independent centers. And this, by the way, was the basis of the Ukrainian Revolution. If you read this book here, this is a very interesting author. This book, this guy here,
Ukraine's maiden
Maidan.
Russia's war.
Yeah, Russia's war. He is a Ukrainian professor, Mikhailo Vinitsky, and he explains what really was behind the 2014 revolution. And what it was is there was quietly growing in Ukraine a middle class of independent people. They weren't wealthy. They had their own businesses, and they wanted a better life for their kids. They weren't dependent, and they didn't like the corruption in the government. They wanted accountability from the government. And when in 2014, the riot police beat up their kids who had protested this, cutting them from the EU and forcing them into the Moscow's Eurasian Union, economic union, they got angry and they went out into the streets, and it began this process of reciprocal violence between the government and the people. And the way he describes what happened is he said that this middle class caused this, he called it a bourgeois revolution, because if you're dependent on the government, you can't make a revolution because you're getting your income from the government. And this is what happened in Russia. A few years ago, there was Yevgeny Primakov, who'd been the prime minister before Putin was, and said, look, we need to let the Russian middle class grow. And from 1998 to 2008, Russia had a tremendous new middle class. You had, 28, 29% of Russians suddenly were either working for independent businesses or they owned their own businesses. And these people weren't wealthy. These were small businesses. And yet these were the people and the children of these people that were doing the protests against Putin at the time when Putin went to get reelected president in 2012. And it was Putin, and I heard through Russian sources that Primakov was very unhappy with this. He said, we're going to smash these people. These people cannot be allowed to protest. They're too independent. We have to, push them down again, not allow them to have this. And of course, Ukraine became a problem for Moscow because they didn't want to become part of the system, because their emerging middle class wanted to have their own life. not being under the thumb of Moscow and Moscow's mafia, larger mafia connection, the system of secret police and mafia and economy from the old Soviet state that was basically wrapped everything up in almost a feudal economic system. But yeah, the Holodomor, some people think 11 million Ukrainians were starved to death in that. And but looking at this larger food shortage in the country, let's talk about fertilizer for a second. Is it so much that China, Ukraine, Belarus are hoarding fertilizer, not because they're just trying to keep everybody else from having it, but they're hoarding the fertilizer because when things get desperate, they're going to need to use that fertilizer as much as possible on the land that they have to keep the food production going for their 150 million people, or you've got Central Asia, you've got tens of millions more, and China's massive food. I mean, they want to be able to keep growing. And if something breaks down, they want to be able to have this also as a weapon to withhold from other countries to say, you have to do what we say, using food as a weapon to control other people.
That's a teeter-totter, isn't it? The higher the fertilizer goes in one country, the lower it goes in another country. So if you're keeping it in to grow higher crops and bring more farmland online, you would need expanded fertilizer usage to bring more land online to produce, expand your production.
Right.
But at the same time, like we're going to see in the US, production's going down, especially in corn. So when you look at corn, see, that's kind of the perfect play to take out the knees of a country. Take the corn production out, because your ethanol is gone too. And corn's the heaviest feeder for fertilizer. And we are going to the most massive corn shortage. And I keep saying recorded history, but I mean, when you're trying to compare it to something back during the Roman Empire, it's not really comparable. Okay, Phoenicians, try to compare corn production out of the Mayan kingdom compared to today. There's a lot of things but I'm trying to put the label on it. The biggest ever losses in corn ever. It is going to rattle the markets. And the thing I keep hearing again from traders that I talk to, these guys are commodities traders that are on the other out of Chicago. And the thing is, they also anticipate a huge amount of people wanting physical delivery off their futures contracts, because corn's going to get so lean across and unavailable across the planet. Exports are going to be restricted, resource nationalism, and what's going to be grown is going to be claimed on contract. So once they can't deliver anymore, the whole house of cards comes down.
Now, corn is used to feed animals, isn't it? A lot of
yeah, but there's a lot of other byproduct that could be used to feed cattle and dairy cattle and chicken and pig. But predominantly it is corn, or the soy crush afterward. After they remove the oil, they take the residual and the pressed cake, and they feed that through. But yeah, you're right. But then, the other thing is, corn's also used in 6,000 products that are on supermarket shelves. You remove that out, the binders, the agents, the cornstarch, the high fructose corn syrup, the corn itself. If you're going to get cornmeal muffins, whatever, there's a lot of corn in a lot of things. Popcorn, bye-bye. Well, that's not really the same kind of corn, but that's not field corn. That's popcorn, a bit different.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But if you're just talking about true field corn, the dent corn is like, if you look at a corn, like the sweet corn, for example, it's all smooth and rounded on the edges, but dent corn actually has that dimple in it, and they call that field corn. So that was your corn 101 lesson there. So the popcorn is going to be different. Your regular sweet corn will be different. That's not really commercial. I mean, it is to a point regionally, but then dent corn or field corn is what you're going to take away. But that's in everything that is on a supermarket shelf in a box contains corn of some way, shape, or form or fashion. So then you're going to start to see things in boxes disappear off the shelves. Forget the cans. It's going to be in a box, usually a dry manufactured product or something with, like I said, corn starch in it. Now, there are some cans of different types of stews that also have the binder agents. The thickening agents are also from corn. So when you start to look at the gamut of almost everything in the supermarket that's in a box, I'm going to stick with boxes. Cans are a little in a box. Imagine if everything in a box on the shelf in the supermarkets actually disappears because we don't grow enough corn. Well, we won't be able to manufacture enough ethanol to keep anything to even blend with the fuels. So if you want to take the knees out of a country, stop the fertilizer, they're going to stop the corn first and the sorghum because they feed too heavy. And then you can see what corn does. And our pipelines in America have magically been cut off. Wait a second. It seems like it's all coordinated globally. I just can't believe all this is happening just for those guys over there. It seems like it's a global unified effort to make it all happen and make it look like it's organic. And it seems like everybody's on the same page because they all have the same information on the intensity of the cycle. Our civilization can't be salvaged at this point. So it's going to be demolished.
So let me ask you, what is exactly do you think is going to happen in October of 2024? What do you see coming?
Well, there'll be a second electromagnetic field in our solar system with the combination of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune combining with their toroid field, looping into a wider, larger field. Now, if you're counting from the outer planets inward, like you referenced there, Jupiter, Mars, Earth. So we'll be 2 planets away from that new magnetic field. Now, it's not going to be incredibly strong as the sun is, but it's a second magnetic field in in the solar system here. So then at the same time, we'll have the sun, it'll be stepping down. We're coming into that point where it's already at the solar maximum, rolling down. It's projected to go into a grand solar minimum solar cycle 26 anyway. Even NASA and European Space Agency are talking about, I mean, incredibly low solar activity, the lowest in 400 years. So we're going to be looping between 2 magnetic fields, our Earth is, in October of 2024. So how's the human perception going to change during that time, being electromagnetic ourselves? And then truly, what are the changes on our planet going to be? What are we going to see?
So going into the winter from October 2024, we're going to see really low temperatures.
Well, it'd be more electromagnetic effects where electrical discharges in the sky and plasma events. We're going to see canyon wall petroglyphs come to life beginning at that time.
You
That's
mean
the beginning
these,
of it?
these,
Yeah, we're truly in
these
earnest when that second magnetic field lines up. Yeah.
super lightning storms?
Oh, electrical discharge beyond, like literally biblical discharge, ground to sky. Because what happens, our Earth is going to be overcharged at that point, and that potential between the two, that needs to fill somehow. Our Earth is going to send that electric current out. Probably, here's my prediction too. The Hall currents that are outbound flows between, say, 20 degrees north and 45 north or south, those 2 belts of our planet. Those
Wait, okay, say
Hall.
that again. 25, say
No,
that again.
20 degrees north latitude to about 45 degrees north latitude. And then in the southern hemisphere, it'd be 20 degrees southern latitude to 20 or 45 degrees.
So I think I'm
southern.
at 46 degrees.
Plus or minus. Okay,
Plus or minus.
We'll include you because we like you. You get the electromagnetic plasma discharges too. You bonus.
I was hoping I was outside of it.
And those are the outbound flow currents versus what we know as the field aligned currents that roll in on the North Pole or the South Pole.
Now, are we talking about storms that happen when like clouds come over and there's a lightning storm and it's just worse? Or what are we talking about?
Yeah, it's not going to be a thunderstorm or like you're saying, to be an electrical storm.
Which is caused by, do you get a cloud cover? Do you need cloud cover for that?
I'm going to say, yeah. Well, you got to look at that. Clouds are also electrically induced. So are tornadoes. So are hurricanes.
Right.
Everything's electrical. So let me tell you, I'm going to tell you a little something here. I was doing some consulting, and this has been almost a year now. So come on. All right. So what I was doing was looking where electrical disturbances were happening in the atmosphere over and over again, whether you were seeing blue jets, red sprites, or elves. And that's an outbound current flow. Like some of those elves, you can actually see the ring of the electrical or I should say magnetic field line coming out. So I started to look at those in depth and really, so I lined up one place, the Volga region of Russia and Oblast was the area.
Okay.
And I was saying, look at oats there, long on oats, because regional oat production, it's the largest amount of oat production in Russia occurs in that region. And if it's disrupted on local weather patterns, because you got to think locally, if there's a higher ionized potential in the atmosphere, there's going to be more cloud cover. Weather patterns are going to shift. You know, it's higher electric frequency coming out of there. So things are going to be electrically different there. Storms are going to change course around it. Cloud cells are going to build there. Discharges.
It's already affecting crop production because temperatures and because there's too much rain or not enough rain.
Well, yeah, when you start to move the jet streams and the cloud cells, and then you have cloud cells bunching on top of themselves, trying to find new areas in the atmosphere or the new flow in the atmosphere. Think of it as a river. Like if two rivers collide together, you're going to see it. The water's going to bunch up. There's going to be turbidity. There's going to be rock formations, new like land banks. There'll be landslides. There'll be all kind of things happening along that riverbank. Well, think it now, take it into the atmosphere and the same thing happening. So then when you have a year's worth of rain in 2 hours, well, that might be where the two rivers are coming together and making that sort of, almost surfable wave within there. You can take it either dense water medium on the earth to explain two rivers crashing together or two streams, or you can take it higher in the atmosphere and do the same exact representations of it. But then you need to add in the jet streams too. And then you need to add in the increasing electrical outbound flow of current. And then you wish that all together, and then you see what happens in certain regions. And then you look back in history books and see where, like in Poland, perfect example. I'm starting to like map out using GIS software, these electrical disturbances across the planet with outbound flows that's going to affect regional weather patterns, which will affect crops directly under there. And then I'm getting a good forecast of where places are going to be lost first. Poland's going to be another one. Those regions right there, I'm calling right now, massive crop losses. Poland, Czech Republic, and Oblast, and the Volga region of Russia. Based on electrical disturbance, changing the weather patterns far more than what's happening just in a global sense. So when I was talking about the cloud cells and jet streams, okay, that's an overall global thing that's happening. Intertropical convergence zone moving, et cetera. That's a global phenomenon. What I'm talking about, very, very pinpoint, precise, laser precise regions that grow crops that are affected by outbound current flow.
Interesting.
So talking about crop losses being electrically induced, see, this is the cycle that the elitists are in on, understand it, governments understand it. And once you get a very, even a basic understanding of when the current is flowing out, it's going to change clouds and how much rain is there. It could either dry it out or make it wet, both. But whatever's happening, think of it as a cylinder coming out of the earth. And whatever is around that cylinder is going to get bounced north or south, east or west out of its normal flowing position.
There's this peculiar passage out of Plato where Solon is talking to the priests in Sais in Egypt. That was the capital of Egypt at the time. And they were talking about this kind of an event, although they described it, they used metaphors that the earth was scorched by Apollo. They described, well, it was really bizarre because the priest, when he described it, he said, well, the people in the lowlands will be fine. It's the people in the highlands that get, basically fried, as if there was like a super lightning storm that struck the highlands. But it's
radiation that went, if you're looking at UV, A, B, and C radiation, so perhaps there was a magnetic field anomaly at that point that went so low that UVC was able to hit. If UVC hit the top of the Himalayan mountains, it wouldn't affect you down there. But if it reached ground level, we'd all be fried. There's been some recent UVB readings that have hit ground level. So it makes sense with what you said, because a lot of those really heavy radiation that would affect you as a human being are going to be at higher latitudes. They're not going to reach what is considered sea level. So that makes perfect sense as what, if there was like that, yeah, I could see something like that would scorch the mountaintops, but down low, you would be okay.
Yeah. And the priest made the point that when, there were giant rocks in the heavens that would fall to the ocean, strike them and displace the water onto the land, causing flooding, then the people in the lowlands were in danger. But when this other thing happened, the people in the highlands were in danger. It was kind of very interesting. And of course, a lot of people paying attention to catastrophic events, they didn't know about electromagnetism, in antiquity. At least they didn't use our terminology in talking about it.
They use Zeus and the thunderbolts to represent
right
it.
Or talk about
cometary bombardment or electrical bombardment. It was all represented in the heavens through all the stories we know. They covered all the bases.
Right. Yeah. They were using stories metaphorically to describe events. This is the thing in Hamlet's Mill, is that they realized that there was also mathematical allusions in these stories, references to the equinoxes and to different geological points on the map or geographical points on the map. So in terms of okay, so in terms of what you're describing, what are we going to experience on the ground? I mean, what is it going to be like? Is it going to, are these events going to outright kill a lot of people, or is it just the destruction of the food supply that's going to kill people?
That's an unknown. I mean, you got to look through chapters of history. But what I can for certain say is our planting and growing seasons are being disrupted globally across all continents. It's not a localized thing. It's a planetary magnetic field thing. And they call it polar wander. And if you want to take a look at it, there's people far more better versed than myself. Go over to Ben Davidson at Suspicious Observers and check out their catastrophism series and look at where they sit right now in magnetic reversal news. And there's a lot of quality info about where our magnetic field is declining to in such a rapid fashion that, you know, they're literally talking about not geopole shift in terms of the actual Earth tipping, but magnetic anomalies and shifts. So the prediction was that the North Pole is going to run somewhere into the middle of the Indian Ocean, west off of Indonesia, and the Southern Pole will also meet somewhere in there, and then whoosh, it will reverse. We're talking about north-south orientation magnetically, not geophysically. So there's a huge amount of information on, you know, just things that were thought impossible in terms of how quickly it could decline the magnetic field is now in real time. And it's baffled. They're even the scientists, quote unquote, are baffled by all these new discoveries on how fast it declined. But if you look through history, they talk about it happening just so fast. Again and again, the ancients come back to teach us. We seem to be the newbies on the block. The ancients have lived it several times, left us the legends, the stories, the signs to look for, signs in the skies, animal behaviors, etc. when we come into these magnetic events. And we're in one right now. So, you know, you start to couple all this together. If I was a government, I certainly would be trying to keep my government together too. I'd be preparing for it, and really probably wouldn't tell the citizens because they'll just be a bunch of boneheads out on the street causing problems before the real problem.
Panic, loss of law and order.
Oh yeah, nobody would obey the rule of law. Are you kidding me? It would be chaos. You'd have to build a fort around your thing, and everybody up on the walls trying to protect your stuff well before what's about to happen. It's in play right now.
It's interesting, you know, even a police state like the Soviet Union, when the German armies were closing on Moscow in late November, early December 1941, there were riots. There was complete collapse of civil order in Moscow. People don't realize this. And the only thing that saved the city was the temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The German army had to bug out of there because their guns didn't work, their cannons didn't work, the temperatures destroyed their ability to use fuel, and it was so low it was affecting the petrol in the tanks They had to abandon things, and basically just had to get out of there because the temperatures fell so drastically. 50, 60,000 German soldiers suffered severe frostbite. People had their eyelids frozen right off, so they lost their sight. People died defecating because it was so cold. If you didn't do it right, you'd die almost instantaneously from the effects. Yeah,
you're painting a crazy picture of that one.
Crazy picture, yes. The order of the frozen meat was the medal that the Wehrmacht struck for those that suffered that winter from the frostbite. And
can you imagine trying to live through that again? If we go out off the system of centralized delivery of fuels and electricity, and you really have to provide your own heat and wood source or coal or whatever you're going to burn in your house to stay warm through that type of temperature, most of Europe won't survive.
Yeah. Of course, Europe hasn't experienced those kind of temperatures since the Ice Age, and but they got
the ocean to keep them warm.
Right? Keep them warm. But in terms of the changing of the climate, could we talk about a mini ice age? Could we suddenly start experiencing those low temperatures here in North America and in Europe, which is normally warmer? Could we start to
Yes.
experience these trans-Arctic temperatures? Yeah.
Well, maybe not trans-Arctic, but I did an interview several years ago with a researcher. His name is David Dilley, Dilley.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about a 9-year pulse of meltwater going under the Arctic, under the sea ice. And it is going to be a warm cycle or a cool water cycle with more melt into it. So that water is not as saline, it freezes faster, it causes the ice cap to freeze faster. But on the inverse, it's more saline on these 9-year cycles. It pulses under and then out of the Arctic Circle. Well, in all of his forecasts going back with the 9-year cycle, we're coming into a cold water, less saline pulse right now. So
Right now.
things are going to start freezing faster, and he predicts massive, unbelievable record cold coming up over these next, starting now, this winter, through the next 9 years. Are going to be unbelievable, record-breaking cold, because he does solar cycles, moon cycles, lunar cycles, in addition to what we're seeing with the AMOC, which is the overturning oscillation in the Atlantic, and then how that affects the pulse waters, more saline, less saline, going up into the Arctic, the ice melting there, that's pushing in more, like I say, it's reducing the salinity of the water that's being pushed under there. He was looking at what are the ice arcs last year? The ice arcs are between Greenland and Newfoundland there, and Nunavut Island, up if you get further up toward the Arctic Circle, that the ice, when it's melting, usually can flow pretty freely out of that area. But for the last 2 years, it's jammed up in there, and they call it ice arc, where it's arcing and then causing a dam behind it. So it's delaying a lot of the melting after the freeze. And then what has happened is it's so backed up there that once it does break free, it sends a huge amount of icebergs, which we've seen those years in a row where shipping had to pull a couple hundred miles south to avoid the icebergs coming out of there. So we're starting to see, more things happening on the natural side that show there's changes as well happening in these last 2 years. Now, not as much research has been done since the COVID, because you weren't allowed to travel to a lot of countries. So it seems that if instrumentation was there, they could still maintain it and get readings, but to put out new instrumentation and take new cores and get people up there to actually visibly, catalog what they're seeing and the changes, kind of got locked in time. But now they're going back again this year because COVID's over, or at least more free for travel.
Right.
But David Dilley's work, you got to check out his stuff. And David, shout out. Thanks for the interview many years ago. I do remember what you told me. And it's going to get chilly across Europe because of that. Now, not subarctic temperatures like affect Russia, but far colder than the normal. And even just that alone, people that don't have access to heating in their homes would not make it through the winter. I mean, without that centralized delivery of your energy into a building in northerly parts of Europe, it's just not going to happen. It's going to be tumultuous, and you'll see why people have moved through history. Population migration accompanies the cold and the non-growing of food because they need to go to better areas, warmer areas that could at least produce food and have an economy so they can participate in that.
So given that that certain people now, how do you suppose this hasn't gotten out to the general public from government researches, that they have been able to hold on to the secret so tightly? I mean, how are they able? They can't seem to hold on to other secret information. How do you suppose they're keeping all this secret if they do indeed know? And who is it that knows? Is it the presidents? Is it people in the bureaucracies, the scientific bureaucracy? How is this handled, do you think?
Well, it's not this great giant secret that everybody is, in a corner of a room, don't tell anybody. There's been plenty of information, thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of peer-reviewed research papers get put out every year. But A, who has the time? And B, when you start to dissect them and then you speak like I do, hey, it's the sun, it's not you, it's not CO2, then suddenly removed from reach of people. And if they do that enough and then they throw out alternative narratives like AGW, global warming, it's self-fulfilling, because every time you want to have the conversation, you're shut down by everybody who's been brainwashed for 40 years about global warming. So it's all out there, except the way that the narrative was constructed stops all conversation about anything other than it's you. And there's a small, and again, there's a small amount of people who understand what's going on and these changes on the cycles, but the general populace doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
I bet less than 1% of the full general populace understands the cycles we're in right now. I'd say a full 5-6% understand that something's really changed with food production, maybe 7, but we're not even at a full 10% of the full globe understanding what's going on yet. But we will coming up in July and August when they do the crop tours. And oh my, by when we come into October of this year for the harvest season, there'll be well over half the planet that will get it at that point. We've been lied to. And then what?
So you think the real food shortages are coming in October then?
Well, the beginning of them.
The beginning of them. So you think that we'll kind of get through the early summer months without people really catching on?
Those involved in futures markets, economic news, ag biz, delivery, supply chains, those in the railroads, yeah, futures delivery, because people at the grain mills, they'll all get it. But I mean, again, that's such a small microcosm of business, and who's going to listen to them except other people in business? Because everybody's too busy watching Netflix or playing their video games or whatever. They don't care that a grain operator just said, I cannot believe we only got 10% of what we normally get over the last 80 years. This is going to be a catastrophe. And they're like, well, my supermarket still has food. It's okay. Bye. And that's the attitude you get predominantly across all spheres of society. Very few people want to know. And if they do know, they'd rather prefer not to know because it's too difficult to deal with.
Wow.
Too bad. You're going to have to deal with it anyway this year. So welcome to the club.
Welcome to the club. And so you will have other systems breaking down, obviously, when this happens.
Yeah, which ones do you think they'll be? Because I'm always trying to glean, others' opinions. Okay, we understand food, and then when food breaks down, the economy breaks down, rule of law breaks down. Okay, and then what?
Well, you have feudalism. Whenever these things break down, you have local relationships and local armed people that end up in control of everything. This is what happened with the fall of the Roman Empire. It was local armed groups that took over for the legions in defending local communities and so forth. So this is what you normally have happen. And of course, those armed groups then distribute the food and decide who eats and who doesn't. And it's a matter of fealty, a matter of loyalty. And if you are loyal to the right people with the guns, then you will be fed. You will be part of the system. If you're not, you're pushed out. You don't have a place. That's just kind of how feudalism worked. There's some interesting books about the fall of the Roman Empire. By the way, we know more about it than we ever have before because of archaeological things and things that have been discovered. Just to describe, the trade collapsed. And people don't realize a basic product was olive oil that everybody used. It was very important, but it was not grown in places. So you have a place like Lyon, France, where they were waiting after the collapse of the empire for the olive oil shipment, the caravan to come with the olive oil from the port down south. And it didn't come. Well, maybe next year, not next year, year after year. Well, we remember it came once, and now suddenly they don't have a product that their local economy was dependent on.
Reminds me of the islands where what was that cult in the World War II where the airplanes would drop supplies and then
the cargo cult.
The cargo cult, that's it. If I had something similar, but in reverse. Well, imagine those first couple of years when the planes stopped coming. For the cargo cult, the same thing. The olive oil shipments quit coming, the caravans quit coming. The salt caravans disappeared across the Ghana Empire in Northern Africa, and the salt route ceased that first couple of years. People would have been, the salt's not coming anymore. Same with that. The cargo planes aren't coming anymore, or the olive oil shipments aren't coming anymore. So imagine a world where we look back and say the oil deliveries aren't coming any longer.
Right. Yeah.
Because oil's being shut off. And I am going to say, I keep reading these articles again and again about diesel shortages poised for the Southeast U.S. and the eastern part of the U.S. Because see, as I look at it in a turning fashion, almost all the duress and problems with supply chain shortages, like problems in the cities, the riots, has all been directed out toward over the Mississippi River going west. But what I see right now is everything's being directed this way. The East is getting it next. And we're starting to with the diesel shortages starting right now. And I want to say right now, You got to see the amount of commercial drivers within companies that are getting messaging going, fill up your rigs right now. They're going to run out in just a few days.
Well,
Yeah.
that implies food shortages coming next month.
If you're not prepared.
Mm-hmm.
But by this point, you should be. If you didn't get the message by now, I'm just sorry. You're never going to get it. And, don't come knocking on my door because you didn't get the messaging after millions of people have been asking and telling you for 2 years now. If COVID didn't wake you up, then I'm sorry, maybe your cognitive skills are in decline or not there at all. But if you haven't seen what happened during that period of time, and if you didn't get a little extra food because of what happened in COVID, or store some extra fuel, or have a network of people, or got some seeds to grow your garden during those 2 years when everything started to shut down, and you're still not getting it, then you're never going to get it. And it's far too late. We got less than 6 months before we're going into a global famine here. And I don't know, not everybody's meant to live through this, and it will be decided who did or didn't. And perhaps that's, in a weird, twisted way, I've heard this from the elite speak about it a few times, that's the way they choose, or who is chosen. There's no like, you get to go next. It's those who survive these times are the ones that should lead those after the collapse and the reassemblance. Because if you were too stupid to make it through this time, then you sure have no right to be telling anybody or making legislation or any types of law enforcement or anything moving forward to the next world that we're entering. You got no right to even be there or even have one iota of what to say goes on. If you don't even have stored food right now, you're not going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way they're looking at it. It's just such a twisted and bizarre thing. I think I would warn people myself, but I'm in the reality of it now, just looking around going, nah, it's just.
Well, you can't. I mean, look, if everybody can't make it, then you don't want to warn people, because then you're going to have food shortages now. You're going to have the collapse coming early, and you're going to have less time to prepare if you are the government, if you are the elite, whatever, if that's what's happening. It's quite grim. Obviously, we're out on a limb because we built the civilization. We got almost 8 billion people on the planet. We have this untenable way of growing food and maintaining people. We've exhausted all the soils. And now we're entering into this period where countries are starting to hoard food, hoard fuel, starting to fight over land, over territory, preparing for war. It looks like World War time. For my thing is politics and war and studying that, and it does look like China, North Korea, Russia, and maybe their friends in Iran and other places are on board with doing something, being proactive, as you can say, to secure what it is they feel they need to look after themselves. And that is really scary.
Well, for me, it's just a history book repeating right now. I mean, you and I, we both could look back in different epochs of history and the exact same things happened. Mm-hmm. Allegiances and alliances were built.
Interesting.
But that purge from World War I was so startling. I just looked at that, just complete waste of humanity. And when I look at it, I really looked at it as just like a sorrowful waste. But it removed so much of the male population out of Europe at that time.
Well, 20 million people, basically.
Yeah, it was sickening to look back in that chapter of history, especially that the trenches. And it was where did the trenches go from, like the English Channel all the way through France, all the way down to like Switzerland or the border of Italy? Like what?
Well, the front lines kept moving. They kept digging trenches at different places. But yeah, warfare was big artillery guns and infantry. The cavalry was no good. They'd have to dismount. You couldn't do a cavalry charge into machine guns. So the cavalry they were fast infantry. They just dismount light infantry and go into the trenches. So everybody was stuck in there because you had to take cover from the artillery and the machine guns and the heavy rifle fire, snipers and stuff, right? So it wasn't until they developed tanks and armor, flamethrowers, infiltration tactics the Germans developed, they were able to get war mobile again, which World War II then was a different kind of war because of that. But I think that if you look at history, the idea that people control history, there's a tremendous limits to human wisdom and human ability to control. And I think that even in social systems, they are too intellectually limited, the leaders are, and the way the system works to really be able to cope with situations like this. The fact is that you have to know too much, and human systems not only are fragile, but they literally don't know. Like the story of the FSB letters, they don't communicate correctly to their own people. What this FSB guy was saying was that if you gave the wrong answer, they wanted you to say that Russia could economically survive if the West had been destroyed by a bunch of meteor strikes. And if you didn't say it, you got called in for questioning. So pretty much people learned pretty early, this is what they want us to conclude. So they concluded that Russia could survive economically without the West being there. And he said, it's not true. We would collapse within 2 months if we were totally cut off. This is what he said in the letters. So it's very interesting. The people upstairs, they don't really listen. They never have listened to the people from below, maybe in some systems more or less. But and then they have their idea of how to organize things. And more often than not, they collapse when they try to organize things that way, because our civilization is built by the market. And the market is everybody coming together voluntarily and trading and doing, because a real economic knowledge is decentralized. It belongs to you, it belongs to me. And the market is where these prices go up and down without the government controlling them, that tells you what we need and what is lacking. And without those mechanisms, the government trying to direct it, it just gets fouled up. And if people are going to die of starvation, if things are going to collapse, that's going to occur. And there's nothing they can do about it, really, except maybe make it worse, which is usually what governments do when they try to direct these things. That's just the perspective of a political sociologist or political economy. But
yeah, my perspective is we are on a farm, and different farming techniques are used in things called nations. And I look at it like that, because from on high, it seems that where you're talking about, the directives coming down are always used to control, crush, reduce humanity into a certain fashion, to continue to milk the labor. And it's been like that since time immemorial, at least the last 3,000 years. So for me, it seems the echelons going to the very top are using the earth as a farm for labor, and whatever our output could be, whether that be agriculture or minerals, IT, whatever, now in the modern age. But think about the different kind of farming techniques. We call that politics, and the different ways to get the output, whether it be through the whip or whether it be through perceived freedom. You know, that's the way I'm looking at it. We're on a farm here.
mm-hmm. Well, freedom always produces more. Slavery always produces less. That's just what we've learned from history, from watching. And if people want to take advantage and get more control, if you have more criminal things, I think there is a cultural and economic decline, an intellectual decline in the West. You look at the leaders today. Are they as smart as the leaders of 100 years ago, or especially 150 or 200 years ago? I think they're not as well educated. They're not as knowledgeable. They're not as wise, and they're not as good as people go. They're not as honorable. And so I think that plays into it too.
Unless that's the illusion we were given, because you look back through history and you just wonder, really, how was history? Because trying to search these cycles back through history, there's a lot of anomalies and missing pieces and chapters that seem to sandwich together or have a big wedge between them, where there was just this gap, and then it picks back up again. Are you really, there was an 800-year gap, and then that's the last thing we heard, and then 800 years later, boom, they pop back up like a gopher sticking their head out of the sand. Like, really, you know, it's riddled with inconsistencies. It's riddled with missing pieces. It's riddled with double speak of the same events. But again, victories, or what is it? History is written by the victors. So I could see a lot of that happening through several thousand years of translations and retranslations. And yeah, we're ready for another cycle. So here we go. Hold on. Take a deep breath. Wave's really big this time.
Yeah, well, I hope it's not as bad as it sounds. October 2024, huh? Wow. All right.
Well, we got to get through this October first. Yeah, I would be super excited to get to October of 2024 to see the light show in the sky. But I'll I'll take this first October as a blessing to get through into next year.
Yeah, certainly it will. Well, all right, very good.
All right. And thanks
Eh,
for staying with us for the chat here. Hope you got something out of it that can help you prepare. And
oh
again,
yeah,
Jeff,
definitely. And my listeners are going to be intrigued. I think this is one of the most interesting conversations. This is the most interesting one we've had so far, and uh, a lot to think about. A lot to think about.
it is. And I'll put all the links in the description box below so you can chase down and then head over to Jeffrey's blog there and check out the articles and information he's putting up. And then also some of the slides and graphics I'll include here that you can also chase down yourself to do more research. Because I want you to do more research. I'm just saying some points. Your job is to disprove it or go with it or use it the way you want to. That's all I'm saying. You need to do your own research. So continue from here and the points that Jeffrey and I had put out today. So anyway, thanks for watching. Jeff, any last thoughts or?
No, I am I'm just amazed, and I'm very concerned about the stuff on China and North Korea. These very weird moves. These are very ominous, and that's I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, we do have this weekend to prepare. So Saturday, Sunday cometh for many who are unprepared. You need to get something prepared. Anyway, bye for now.